Yeah, so thank you so much, Loic and Magdalena, for organizing this amazing event. And yeah, it feels like, kind of like a new potentiality here in this bridging of, the latest of technology and entrepreneurship and ancient wisdom, kind of Gaia wisdom and so on. I feel there's like something, very beautiful could develop from this in the future, and I feel really honored to be part of it. So I've written a number of books. These are those books, or some of them. The first one, Breaking Open the Head, came out 20 years ago when psychedelics were not such a thing anymore. They weren't such a thing at that point. And in fact, it felt kind of taboo in New York to kind of write about them or talk about them. And when I started that book, I was in my sort of mid to late 20s. I was a journalist. I'd grown up in a sort of secular materialist framework. So I didn't believe that there was like a soul or a spirit or anything outside of this life. But I felt this yearning to, see if there was anything else. And I remembered my psychedelic experiences back in college as the most sort of significant consciousness experiences I'd had that suggested that maybe there were other dimensions of psychic life and so on. So that led me, I went to West Africa. I was a journalist, so I was able to get assignments to go to different cultures and so on. So I went to Gabon and visited an indigenous culture called the Bwiti, who use iboga, sometimes known in the West as ibogaine, as their sacrament for initiation. And that's one of the longest lasting psychedelics. It's like a 20 to 25-hour trip. It's being used a lot now for addiction treatment, particularly for heroin addiction. It's extremely powerful. I ended up visiting an indigenous culture called the Sequoia in Ecuador in the Amazon. And I visited the Mazatecs in Mexico briefly. And then also began to look at, the sort of modern psychedelic movement. I ended up at the Burning Man Festival. I interviewed Alexander Shulgin, who was one of the, this amazing chemist who created hundreds of psychedelics. He rediscovered MDMA in the 60s and 2CB and 2CI and all these compounds. When I started writing Breaking Open the Head, part of my instigation was, once again, this feeling of, the sort of nihilistic, emptiness of the materialist culture. And also I'd started writing about ecological topics, and I'd noticed that it was really impossible to get a cultural conversation going about those topics. And when I went down to the Amazon in Ecuador, we were shown, these huge tracts of the Amazon that had been despoiled, by the oil companies. And essentially what would happen would be like, a few million acres would be opened up for oil. And then that rainforest would quickly disappear as mestizos moved in and tried to create farms and so on. And it really gave me a very, apocalyptic feeling when I learned that, every time we did this and we sort of wiped out, millions of acres of the Amazon, we were extracting enough oil to keep the U.S. demand for oil going for like, 3 days or something like that. And I began to realize that's what was happening all around the planet. And that gave me the sense that we were in a deeply unsustainable system, which has been something that's been a shadow over all of my work. And I was very pleased actually to have this conversation with Reza earlier. I think that we need as much as possible as we can to look at fully frontally what's happening ecologically. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So then my second book. So when I wrote the first book, I discovered that there was this shamanic cosmology, and ultimately I shifted from the materialist worldview to accepting kind of a Jungian, psychic, occult kind of view of reality. I became very inspired by people like Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner, and basically because I had so many experiences, paranormal experience, psychic experience. I mean, how many people here have been working with these types of plant medicines or psychedelics? Yeah. And how many people sort of feel that, they've had psychic experiences or things, synchronicities, things that sort of have demonstrated to them that, the sort of the world and the psyche are somehow more interrelated than the materialist worldview allows us to imagine, So I discovered that, from my perspective, these indigenous cultures had profound knowledge for us in our modern Western civilization. And then I also learned that many of these cultures have prophetic systems of knowledge where they have ideas about what's happening around the planet and what's going to come in the near future. So that led me to the second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And that book was looking at a range of prophetic concepts from the Maya, from the Mayan calendar to the Aztecs. I visited the Hopi in Arizona. I also looked at the Judeo-Christian ideas around apocalypse and so on. And I began to, sort of sharpen my philosophical perspective to this focus on what's called idealism or analytic idealism as a kind of alternative hypothesis to scientific materialism. So the idealist idea is that actually consciousness is foundational. It's actually the ontological primitive, as Bernardo Kastrup says. Kastrup is a really fantastic philosopher. He was a computer scientist at CERN. He was studying artificial intelligence. And then, based on the research he was doing, he really made the shift to this analytic idealism philosophy. And he's now written a series of books that I think just make total sense, where they, flipping it, then understanding. One of his books is called Why Materialism is Baloney. And another one is called The Idea of the World. So he talks about how, we have this idea that the mind is in the body, but actually the body is in the mind. The mind is the medium through which we experience reality. It's all we can really know, and everything, comes through that. And actually there's, if we look at the 20th century experiments of quantum physics and so on, it's more and more clear that consciousness is somehow creating reality, and the brain is more of a filtering mechanism. And in fact, in some of the research, recent work they've been doing with Imperial College, where they were trying to figure out, kind of how psychedelics work, they discovered that actually they decrease blood flow to the brain. And actually, rather than creating more brain activity, there's actually less brain activity. So that would suggest that actually what they're doing is allowing for more of this ontological primitive, this underlying consciousness to become available to us. So we see different possibilities or different levels of reality, And so that was the 2012 book. And then I spent a long time kind of thinking about kind of where we could go as a species. When I wrote that book, I looked at these different things that suggested to me that this prophetic understanding made sense. If we talk about, the evolution of technology, the, kind of emergence of all these esoteric knowledge systems, which are becoming more available and fit together very, very well. So now we can see that whether it's Gnosticism or Eastern, kind of practices like Indo-Tibetan Buddhism or Amazonian shamanism, there isn't so much disagreement. And those understandings really mesh with, what we're discovering from quantum physics and what somebody like Kastrup has kind of, constructed with this idea of analytic idealism. So I feel that we're on the cusp of a new paradigm, as I said in the title, a sort of post-materialistic philosophy, post-materialist metaphysics. And I think it's a profound transformation. I mean, in the 2012 book, I also looked at ideas around reincarnation. There's a scientist at the University of Virginia who spent his career studying spontaneous past life recall in children around the world. He collected thousands of cases. He wrote a book called Where Biology and Reincarnation Intersect. And he would go and visit these children, and he would find that they would remember these past lives in other towns. He would bring them to these other towns. And he would meet the relatives that used to be part of their family. Sometimes they would have a significant birthmark on their neck, and it would turn out that in the last life had died from a knife wound or something. And so he documented this with photos and so on, and a number of other, kind of people have been following up on that kind of research. So, and obviously this is how Tibetan Buddhists understand the world. I was in Ibiza recently. I had a chance to talk to this Tibetan Lama, and he has a monastery in Bhutan. And I've been fascinated with this concept of the rainbow body, which is that some of these high-level monks, when they pass away, some are able to just maintain their body so that it doesn't decay for several months, and that's been well documented. And in some cases, the body actually shrinks, almost like they're reabsorbing the physical into the astral or into these other dimensions. And he said this actually happened to his father. His father had this rainbow body when he passed away, and that this Tibetan Lama said that his father was not going to return. His father was done with earthly existence and earthly incarnations, but he actually asked his father to come back. And he said, yeah, now my father is a 2-year-old boy in Bhutan, And, for me, I think that he knows what he's talking about. Like, it was very matter of fact the way he said it, very kind of sweet. So, one of the thinkers who's meant a lot to me is Rudolf Steiner. And Rudolf Steiner said that the sort of mission of his life on Earth, he was a philosopher, visionary, who created the Waldorf school system and his own esoteric kind of teachings called anthroposophy. He said the mission of his life on Earth was to bring the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West. That even in the West, people incarnate again and again. He also talked about not only the people incarnating in different bodies, but the planet itself going through a reincarnational cycle. So these are very like mystical and occult ideas, and they take a lot to kind of sift and sieve through. So these ideas that consciousness is somehow this ontological primitive, that maybe this life is not it, that maybe there are past and future lives, other conditions of existence. I think that as more and more of us get a handle on this, it's a profound shift. And it's very, I think, fascinating that such a shift comes at this time, when we're seeing this kind of destruction, physically, which is what, Reza was talking about. One of the things that I've kind of have a feeling about, or, sort of an irritation about, is that it feels like a lot of people have gone through these initiatory practices and processes. They've worked with Eastern cultures, they do meditation, they've been doing the ayahuasca and so on. But I feel in a way the initiation has stopped too quickly, and there's almost like another stage which we need to go, where we think about these kind of systems and structures on the planet and how we actually transform them. An issue which we haven't been discussing in this conference, but I think is one that's worthy of discussion, is whether capitalism in any form can take us any further. Capitalism is a human-made system. It's an economy that got us to this point, but it's inherently growth-based. It forces constant development. It's debt-based. It forces a lot of inequalities and so on. Is it possible that we have the capacity to create like a different economic system, different political systems, and there I think there's a lot that we could learn from indigenous cultures. So for instance, in How Soon Is Now, my third book, I talked about this anthropologist, Pierre Klaust, who wrote a book, Society Against the State, where he was looking at Amazonian cultures and how they really don't have leaders. There's a chief, but the chief doesn't have power over. There's no hierarchical power in a lot of these indigenous cultures. You can also look at, the Iroquois Confederacy and how those cultures were organized. And in fact, in the Iroquois Constitution was one of the bases for the American Constitution. But for them, they didn't really, believe in, aggregating private property, and they empowered women equally as men. Women had a totally equal political role, even a more powerful political role. So I think that when we talk about this, fascination with indigeneity that we're seeing now, we have to go from just enjoying their ceremonial practices or having these exotic experiences and feeling that we sort of tune up, to learning a lot about the systems and structures that they used to create, societies that in some ways, probably are quite superior than ours. Not to romanticize them and to say that they had all of the answers, but there's a lot there for us to draw upon. So this third book, How Soon Is Now, was my effort to kind of tackle the ecological crisis that we're facing from a kind of systems design perspective. I was very inspired by like Buckminster Fuller, Hannah Arendt, other thinkers like that. And one thing I've sort of tried to do a lot is kind of look at the evolution of humanity almost from an organismic perspective. Like it's almost like if you think about humanity, we're like a giant planetary organism that's in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth as a whole system. Right? And that's become more and more apparent over the last few centuries as we grew in number and we created technologies and so on. So now we've, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, we were spread out, we were small in number. Now we've built the roads, we built the shipping lines, we built the fiber optics cables, we have the satellite systems. So it's almost like we're hooking ourselves up to be one global brain or one global consciousness. But somehow we don't really know how to switch on that consciousness yet. And perhaps this evolutionary crisis that we're facing as a species is the necessary catalyst to move from this sort of individuated, tribal, nationalistic state of consciousness to actually being something like a unified planetary mind, unified planetary species, where we actually move from competition into cooperation. One of the books I looked at was a book by Bruce Lipton and Steve Behrman called Spontaneous Evolution. And in that book, they talk about, like if you look at physical evolution, there tends to be kind of like a development from competition, aggression, and domination to a cooperation and symbiosis as an ecosystem becomes more mature. So for instance, a tree is a much older, kind of organism than the human being, and trees are incredibly symbiotic. They're shelter for, birds, worms, bugs, vines, and so on, mycelia. So there's a certain point, and they talk about how even our own bodies are made up these vast colonies of microorganisms that were once competing in environments for scarce resources, and actually in this process of competition somehow learned to fuse together and form these more complex aggregates, which became our organs. So our bodies are actually the history of the shift from competition and domination to cooperation and symbiosis. So if we think about that on a planetary scale, we could ask ourselves, what are the nascent organs in humanity's collective body? If we were to see ourselves as a kind of planetary organism. And I think when I ask myself that question, very strangely, I think the closest thing to it are multinational corporations. So you could think about an energy company as like the circulation system that's moving the blood through the body and putting energy in different places. A media company is kind of like the sensory organs, which take in like the raw data, and then they turn that data into memes, into narrative that define how the organism functions or what it attempts to do as its goals. So when you have a mass media that tells people that they're, that they're consumers, that they're meant to, interact with brands and products in a certain way, they're indoctrinated by that philosophy, and that becomes this mass consumer society. So I think there's a little bit of hope as we go into this, mega crisis, which seems to be unfortunately unavoidable at this point, as we miss some of the turnoffs. If we were to, enough of us maybe were begin to understand it on a systems level as a potential evolutionary movement, through trauma, through catastrophe into a new unified planetary consciousness based on symbiosis and cooperation, we might get someplace more awesome at the end of it. And I think that when we understand that, consciousness is the underlying reality, we can look at deprivations, discomfort differently. These become like initiatory opportunities. Opportunities for us to deepen our awareness, to intensify our state of presence and being, and also what the Tibetan Buddhists talk about, and I think somebody mentioned yesterday, bodhicitta, sort of loving kindness, to embody that more and more. So those are some of my thoughts. I publish a newsletter, danielpinchbeck.substack.com. It's very fun. I get to share continuing stuff as it goes along, so please join up. Also I'm working on a Web3 project myself on the bottom here, beyond.us with a 0. And so our idea is to kind of how do we shift kind of the consciousness of society towards this new consciousness almost as an evolutionary opportunity. So our idea is to take artists and send them through different types of experiences. Like, for instance, we're going to send a group of artists to the Monroe Institute where they do an out-of-body training. And then the artists will create art out of those experiences, and then we'll make NFTs out of those. So we're sort of figuring out how can we kind of infuse some of this Web3 space with this kind of purpose of evolving consciousness, furthering the investigatory edge of consciousness, and so on. So I'm down to 20 seconds. Many things more that I would love to share with you, but I think this is about what we have time for today. Thank you so much.